Vikings. Just saying the word makes you think of crazy warriors attacking villages, burning churches, and drinking from the skulls of their enemies. But here's the thing. Almost everything you think you know about Vikings is probably wrong. And yes, that includes the skull-drinking thing. They didn't do that. Who even started that rumor? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to realize that Vikings might have been smarter and more advanced than most people in medieval Europe. Let's talk about what we think we know about Vikings. Thanks to movies, TV shows, and honestly, some pretty bad history classes, most of us picture Vikings as wild barbarians who spent their whole lives attacking and stealing from people. They're basically shown as the medieval version of a biker gang, except with axes and really cool beards. Pop culture has told us this story so many times that going Viking means going completely crazy. And look, I get it. That's an exciting story. Vikings are cool, they're tough, they sailed into the unknown, weren't afraid of anything, and had names like Eric Bloodaxe and Ivar the Boneless. I mean, come on. But here's where it gets interesting. The more you actually look into Viking history, the more you realize something doesn't add up. See, if Vikings were just mindless raiders, how did they establish some of the most important trade routes in medieval Europe? How did they found cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev? How did they develop sophisticated legal systems and democratic assemblies called things centuries before most of Europe? And here's the kicker. Most Vikings weren't even raiders. The vast majority were farmers, craftspeople, and traders. The raiding? That was more like a summer job for some of them. A gap year, if you will. Okay, but hold on. Before you think I'm about to tell you Vikings were just peaceful farmers braiding each other's hair, stick around. Because the truth is way more interesting than either story. Vikings were neither terrible monsters nor peaceful hippies. They were complicated, just like us, and that's what we're about to explain. All right, let's look at the actual facts and see what Vikings were really like. First, the raiding. Yes, it happened. The attack on Lindisfarne Church in 793 CE was totally real and totally brutal. But here's what nobody tells you. Churches back then were basically medieval banks. They were buildings with no guards, full of gold, silver, and valuable books, right on the coast. From a Viking's point of view, that's not being savage, that's being smart. They were going after the easiest targets with the most treasure. That's actually pretty clever. Second, Vikings had huge trade networks stretching from North America to the Middle East. They traded amber, furs, and slaves for silk, silver, and spices. Viking merchants were respected in Constantinople, the most advanced city in Europe at the time. You don't build that kind of reputation by just being violent thugs. Third, their society was surprisingly ahead of its time. Viking women could own property, divorce their husbands, and run businesses. Compare that to medieval Europe, where women were basically treated like property themselves. Viking culture had female warriors, shield maidens, and powerful female characters in their mythology. Not perfect by today's standards, but way ahead of their time. But here's where it gets complicated, and where we really need to dig deeper. The Vikings did have slaves. They captured and sold people throughout their lands. That's terrible by any modern standard, but also, so did basically every other major civilization back then. The Vikings weren't specially evil. They were doing what was common in the medieval world. They also had brutal violence in their culture. Family feuds were common. Outlaws could be killed on sight. Their stories are full of pretty gruesome stuff. But then again, medieval Europe had public executions for entertainment, and the Catholic Church was starting crusades. Context matters. The more you research, the more you realize we're dealing with a culture that was violent by our standards, but not really more violent than everyone else at the time. And in some ways, they were actually more civilized. Here's the truth we've been searching for. Vikings were human. They were complicated people living in a tough environment, trying to survive and do well. They were farmers who sometimes raided, traders who sometimes fought, poets who could also be warriors. They had a rich tradition of stories and poetry. They loved riddles and word games. They took baths more often than most Europeans, actually, which kind of embarrassing for medieval Europe. The savage Viking idea? That mostly comes from the people they raided, specifically Christian monks who wrote the histories. And surprise, surprise, the monks who got raided weren't exactly giving fair reviews. Dear Diary, today some very rude Scandinavian guys visited our church. 0 stars. Would not recommend. Medieval Christian writers had every reason to make Vikings seem like terrible pagans. It helped them fight back, it made good propaganda, and it fit their worldview. But the stuff archaeologists dig up tells a different story, one of a smart, flexible, and complex culture. Accepting this truth means we have to let go of some pretty cool mythology. We have to admit that history is way more complicated than good guys and bad guys. We have to recognize that the people we call Vikings saw themselves as farmers, traders, explorers, and yes, sometimes warriors. They weren't one big group of attackers. They were Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes with different cultures, goals, and values. We also have to admit that our modern idea of Viking is mostly a made-up story from the 1800s. The romantic nationalism of that time created the horned helmet image, which, by the way, Vikings never wore. That was total fantasy. Opera fantasy, specifically. Letting go of these myths means accepting a more complicated, less exciting-sounding truth. Vikings weren't specially savage. They were people of their time. So where does this leave us? We're coming back to our modern world with a better understanding. Vikings were successful not because they were savage, but because they could adapt. They could farm, trade, explore, and yes, when they needed to, fight. They were amazing shipbuilders, skilled sailors, and clever planners. The Viking Age lasted about 300 years, from roughly 800 to 1100 CE. During that time, they explored more of the world than almost anyone else, started lasting settlements, changed languages and cultures across Europe, and eventually became part of the societies they once raided. That's not a story of being savage. That's a story of change and adaptation. Here's what we can take away from all this. The myth of Viking brutality says more about us than it does about them. We love simple stories, heroes and villains, civilized and savage. But real history is messy and complicated and human. Vikings were both things at once, not just one thing. They were traders and attackers. They were poets and warriors. They were smart and violent, just like every other complicated civilization in history. Understanding this doesn't make Vikings less interesting. It makes them more interesting. Because real people dealing with real problems in a harsh world, that's a better story than cartoon barbarians. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us to question the simple stories we're told about other cultures and other people today. So the next time someone says, "Those Vikings were savage," you can say, "Actually, they were farmers who sometimes did side quests, had better hygiene than medieval Europeans, and gave women more rights than most of the so-called civilized world." If this video changed how you think about Vikings, hit that like button. If you want more myth-busting history content, subscribe and ring the bell, and drop a comment telling me what historical myth you want me to tackle next. Thanks for watching.